loading process. And then we'll talk about how we can do some post-load validation. And then we'll get into some other things for you to consider if you're looking to go from PeopleSoft to Workday, just general topics. But then we'll talk about a couple gotchas that just probably need to be prepared for. And then we'll try and save 10, maybe 15 minutes towards the end for some Q&A. So in as far as an overview is concerned, Workday implementations are broken into builds. And what I have here, I have the 4 main builds that happen in every Workday implementation. They're not limited to these 4, but this is the general set of builds. A build is an iteration of loading data into a Workday tenant, doing some sort of checkout or testing or comparison back to your source system, and then seeing what kind of issues you ran into, through that build, and then preparing for the next build. So the standard builds for a Workday implementation are the configuration and prototype, affectionately referred to as the CNP build. In this build, you are not trying to load every single piece of data from your source system into your new Workday tenant. You are simply trying to do some proof of concept on your extract methodology and your transformation, making sure that the data you load in there is correct. And this is where your functional teams will really focus on their configuration of your Workday tenant, and making sure that when data is presented into that system, that those configurations that they've put together all work as expected. A lot of reworking of those configurations happen in this build. And from a data conversion perspective, you're really looking, sometimes you only load a few files. If in the end you're going to end up with 100 files that you're going to load into Workday, you may only load 10 of them in the CNP build. Just kind of depends on what configurations need to be tested out, and then you go from there. After you complete your configuration prototype build, you then are into your end-to-end build. End-to-end is where you're going to test integrations, external integrations, and from a data conversion point of view, you're trying to build on what you had in the CNP build. You're going to load more files. You're going to expect better load percentages, more complete data. Through end-to-end, when you're complete with that, then you go into a parallel build. This is where you're going to run payrolls in Workday and compare them back to PeopleSoft payrolls. And that's obviously for your payroll team to do. But this is where we really, from a data conversion point of view, we want to have accurate data. We don't want to have a bunch of files that have major issues that cause a ton of variances in those comparisons of the Workday payroll back to PeopleSoft. So we're really looking to finalize extract logic, mapping logic, to make sure that that parallel is as smooth as possible, that parallel test. And presuming that you get through a successful parallel test, then you are prepared and ready to go for a go live implementation at that point, sometimes referred to as a gold build. So those are the 4 main. Doesn't mean that you can't do 2 end-to-end builds, or it just depends on the complexity of your particular implementation. Sometimes these 4 is all you need and all you're going to get. But in maybe some more complex environments, you can repeat certain builds if necessary. One particular thing I'll call out here is catch-up cycles. So within a build, typically just your go live build, you may have catch-up cycles. What is a catch-up cycle? That in an environment where you have a production PeopleSoft system, you can't always shut off your users' interaction with that environment 2 months ahead of go live for Workday, right? You may go into a freeze period a month before, where you're trying to really limit the number of transactions in your legacy system before go live. So you may do a extract and a load cycle to get your initial set of data into your Workday tenant, and then come back 2 weeks later before, let's say, a blackout period where you absolutely shut off new hires and any kind of benefit transactions. Don't get hung up on the 2 weeks. It could be 5 days. It could be, you may not have it at all. But if you have periods where you don't want to wait until the very end to pull all of your data, so maybe a larger conversion effort where you're talking about tens of thousands of employees or hundreds of thousands, who knows, you're going to need a little bit more time than we're shutting off the old system, we're going to pull the data and we're going to load it. You can't do that in one night. So to give yourself a little bit more time to deal with the loading of those files, you'll pull data early, load it into the system, and then you'll come back for a catch-up cycle that will look for any new hires, any people that terminated, and how to handle those with another conversion cycle in Workday. Oh, too far here. So from conversion, for each of those builds, there are steps that you go through in a conversion effort. You're going to extract the data. That's just pulling your raw data out of your source system. You're going to transform that raw data into Workday values. A PeopleSoft department ID of 1234 may not be a value in Workday of 1234. It could be ABC 1234 or whatever the case might be. So just like any kind of a conversion effort, you have to take your source legacy data and convert it into appropriate data for your new system. So we have to transform that data. Then that data obviously has to be loaded, and then you have to validate the data. How do you know that what you tried to load into the Workday tenant actually made it there? And how do you know that it's accurate? So these are some topics that we're going to cover here today. So going into data extraction, one thing I guess I didn't point out earlier, as a client that will be converting from PeopleSoft to Workday, in every case that I've been involved in, and I believe is pretty much true in every implementation of a Workday environment, you'll have an implementation partner. That implementation partner should sit with you, whether it's the functional team, whether it's your technical team, or both, and walk through what data needs to be converted. And that's all managed in what I've always referred to as data gathering workbooks. So this is, for example, I have one that we'll look at here in just a minute, but if we take a hire file, we need to populate a hire file to load into Workday. We need to go through what fields are going to be on that file, and then where do we go get that data from in PeopleSoft. Identifying that will help the functional teams understand where the technical team is going to pull the data from. It tells the technical team where to pull the data from, and it's documentation on that process. So when we look at the workbook here in a little bit, it'll become a little bit more clear, but these are basically your design documents for how you're going to pull the data to populate the files. Well, how do you populate the data? There's many different ways that you could do it. What I've seen commonly used is just straight SQL. If you're pulling from a relational database, you can create SQL scripts that will pull data, it'll transform data, and make it available for you to essentially copy and then paste into a file that will be loaded to Workday. You can also use PeopleSoft queries. I've seen that done. I've also seen SQRs be built. The programming part of that, if you use an SQR, you could easily kick off all of your extracts at one point in time and let them run, and all of your data is available. The automation of that is nice and maybe not as easy to do if you just write straight SQL scripts, but even in just a SQL environment, you can find ways to run one script after another with no problem. But each of them has their, I guess, slight advantages over the other, but there isn't a clear cut, it really should be done this way. But those are three options, probably the three more common options that are used. One thing that I always recommend to a client is that when you go into a conversion effort, that you build a main table that has all of the employees that you're going to convert. I've yet to come across anyone that's going to convert every historical employee that they've ever had. You're not just going to take your active employees, right? It's not quite that simple, because you're still going to have terminated employees get converted because you're going to have to produce a W-2 at the end of the year for them, or you want your retirees to be in the system so that they can maintain their benefits and so on and so forth. So it's not just active employees, but it's not every employee you've ever had. So to not have to replicate that logic across every script that you build to pull hire files, to pull address files, to pull compensation files, and so on and so forth, you don't want to have to rebuild that logic every single time. So first step is to lock down and make sure you fully understand who is getting converted and who is not. And for those folks that are getting converted, or for those employees or people of interest or contingent workers or whatever they are, that you create a table that has all of them in there, and nobody should be in there that is not being converted. So if you have somebody that terminated 8 years ago, you most likely will find no need to convert them. They would not be in that table. So now you have a central, what I refer to as the mothership, right? These are the people that are going to be converted. And that makes it very easy then when you go into all of your subsequent scripts to say, let's build a hire file. Well, we only need to build a hire file for people that are in that table. So creating this driver table that is the starting point for every script that you have is very helpful in not having to replicate what can be very complex logic on who and who is not going to be converted. In our scripts that I've built, we always do some sort of a validation of the data as we're pulling it out. We like to, make sure that for example, if you have a hire file, there are certain required fields on there. Like you have to have an employee ID, you have to have a full-time or part-time status, you have to have a cost center or whatever. One of the easiest things you can do is go through and say, okay, are we going to have any people that do not have the required fields that we need? That could be because your PeopleSoft system doesn't require it, but Workday will. So you can do some very basic validation as you're pulling data out that you can, presuming that it's going to be a technical team that does that extract, that you can share with your functional team, your business folks, and make sure that they understand, hey, there's going to need to be some either data cleanup, or maybe we need to start populating some fields in PeopleSoft before we do this conversion. So there's a validation process built into that extract as well, just to make sure that the data that you're pulling is going to be data that can make its way through to Workday. In the end, you ultimately want to create a raw data file, right? And that data is what your functional team is going to review. The technical team will pull that data and say, okay, here's the 10,000 records in the hire file. Go ahead and take a look at it. They can do VLOOKUPs on it, because this is what all be normally is in Excel. They can do whatever kind of validations they want to do as a functional team to make sure that we're including the right people, that we're including the right values, so on and so forth. So that raw data file is what you'll pass on then to your functional team to make sure that they can review it before it's handed to the implementation partner to load, which we'll get to eventually. When we talk about validating data, so you have to let your functional team know, hey, these are the issues that we're seeing as we validate the data coming out of our source system. So you need to produce some sort of a spreadsheet that will let them know, hey, we have 100 employees that are missing their hire date. We have 100 employees that don't have standard hours. You know, those might be some pretty wild scenarios, but just gives you kind of an idea of how, relaying that type of information onto your functional team and your data owners. So in an extract script, we have some general requirements. I'll refer to them as just things that they need to have. You're obviously going to have SQL or some sort of logic that pulls data out of your source system. You're going to execute these basic validations on that data. And then you need to produce a result set that you can copy out of SQL Server Management Studio or wherever you're running your SQL and paste it into an Excel document that you can move along across the different teams. Some additional options would be, well, let's version all of this data, right? That can kind of come in handy as you go from build to build to build to know, okay, in the parallel build, we had 5,000 records in this file. And when we get to go live, we have 90,000 records. Something's not right, you know, or maybe it is right, but there are ways that you can utilize the older data that you've pulled in previous builds as you go into a new build to kind of do a litmus test on how are we doing here. So versioning that data, storing it in a table and versioning it. So having a CNP version, having an end-to-end version, so on and so forth, it can be helpful. You don't want to have to update every script for each build you go through. It's nice to have a script dynamically know that, oh, we're in the parallel build. So maybe you have a table that says this is the build parameters, and it would tell each script, you know, which build is current, which ones are closed or not in effect right now, and then it would know, okay, we need to pull data as of this date, and we need to, you know, include terminated people through this date, and so on and so forth. We'll look a little bit at that here in a bit, but the point I'm trying to make here is that when you build a script for your CNP build, you don't want to have to go back in and update it just to tell it a new effective date when you get to your end-to-end build. That the less you have to touch those scripts, the less you introduce problems and different issues that you could have avoided. So when you can build these dynamically, then they just know, okay, we're not in CNP anymore, we're in end-to-end, so we have a new set of dates we need to deal with. And then this is a little bit more difficult, but as you're producing files, it's helpful to be able to compare a hire file to a service dates file. So you can say, I want to make sure that I'm not hiring anybody prior to their original hire date, right? Or you might want to say, I have somebody in the additional jobs file. You better have them also in the hire file, because you can't just have additional jobs. You have to have a primary job and in order to have additional jobs. So doing cross-file validation, you could do that in these scripts as well. Introduces some timing challenges, but those are things that you can work through and get your timing right so that you can do those types of things. So a raw validation script example would be here. And we get back up to the top. When we get through this, I'll ask if anybody has any questions. So if you've got some, we'll get to those here in just a few minutes. So I'm not here to teach you SQL. I'm not going to go through every line on this, but I will cover like general areas within this, which happens to be a higher data extract script that we've used in the past. So like I said, talking about knowing the script, knowing what build you happen to be in. At the very beginning here, the first thing we do is look at a table we create as the conversion team that says these are the build parameters for each build. And when we're running these scripts, we only want to run it on the build that's active, right? So that's going to tell us, it could tell us anything, right? But in this particular instance, it was able to tell us, okay, well, what's the maximum effective date we're using for this build? What windows of time do we need to look at for people that are terminated that we want to convert, so on and so forth. So that's, we do that right at the beginning. We store some variables and then they get used throughout the script. In this case here, we go right into pulling data. If we scroll down here a little bit, if there are any technical folks on, we have the PS job table and we have a job code table and addresses and so on and so forth. And this is us pulling all the different locations of data in PeopleSoft together and saying, okay, this is what we need in order to create a hire file for Workday. We store that in a table. We'll eventually extract it back out, but for the purposes of versioning, you can see here, this is our gold or go live version. But we also would have had a underscore parallel version of the hire data file or an underscore E2E version for end to end, so on and so forth, right? So this is us, pulling the data and storing it in a table. Having it in a table then allows us to then turn around. Well, one thing I'll say here, maybe you can't perform all of your extract logic in just one SQL statement. Maybe it's easier to break it apart and say, okay, well, we can do a bulk of it in one select, but then you can turn right around and perform additional logic on that data and continuing to get it set up so that you can put it into a Workday ready file. So this is an example of not just doing it all in one fell swoop with one SQL statement, but kind of an iteration here. But then we get into data validations, right? So in this case here, we're checking required fields first. All right, well, we can't have any blank employee IDs. We can't have any blank hire dates or null hire dates, so on and so forth. We go through all of those. And eventually we get through anything that's required and say, okay, well, these are things that we've either come across in previous builds, or we know that this data anomaly exists in our PeopleSoft environment, and these are things that we want to check for. So we may be checking for temporary staff without an end employment date. We could check for scheduled hours greater than default hours, right? Your job profile in Workday may say that this is a 20-hour per week job. But if we have somebody in that job code that will ultimately convert to that job profile in PeopleSoft that has 40 hours, well, Workday's not going to be happy with you saying this person works 40 when they are in a job profile that says it's 20, that it cannot be more than what's in the job profile. So these are just various things that we'll go through and check that we can do right when we pull the data. There's no point in waiting for the data to load to say, oh, yeah, right, we can't have this person with 40 hours when their job profile says 20. And so anything we can do proactively will save us time in the chaos of when we're actually loading files to deal with it now rather than later. And then, as we get to the end, ultimately, we just pull the data then out of that hire data table, and we can copy the results of that into an Excel file. One thing before I ask on questions here, I realized, where is my, 1 second here. One thing I didn't have open. I talked earlier about a data gathering workbook. So this would be an example of a data gathering workbook. We have a change log on the front end, right? But then this is really the details of it. And these are the Workday fields highlighted here. And then ultimately, where are we going to pull those for this particular client, right? Well, employee ID, we can get that from job. Or hire date, we can get that from anywhere. And this just basically tells us where are we going to pull the data from. here's where we have, in your implementation partner will help you identify what's required and what's not. But we have, fields that are indicated as being required. And this is what we drive those required validations off of. So you can put your notes in here, transformation notes, like we can put links to mapping documents so that we know, okay, well, supervisor ID is going to get mapped to a soup org, or job code is going to get mapped to a job profile in Workday. So that's where you can identify this as well. And in this particular example, do we care about changes in supervisor ID in a catch-up cycle? If Ryan has Joe as a supervisor during the initial extract and build, but then in catch-up he has Susan, do we care? No. In this case, we're going to ignore that. So anyway, a lot of things that you can document when it comes to a particular file. You should have these for each file. So if you're going to have a hire file, an additional jobs file, pay group assignment file, local taxes file, all of it, they should all have this type of documentation along with them. And it's a group effort. It's you as a client, your functional folks, it's your technical team, and it's also your implementation partner working through and figuring out what data do you need to pull so that you can convert it. So data gathering workbooks, we talked about the script, and we'll kind of walk through just a basic example of that. This is not necessarily a one size fits all, so there could be adjustments that need to be made to these. But Aspire has a library of these that we can use as starting points and build on them, and also adjust them to any kind of customizations that are needed for a particular client. So back to here. Any questions on extracting data out of your source system?
We don't have any questions in the chat.
Okay. Then we'll continue on, and we'll talk about transforming data.
I had one question. Sorry,
yeah.
My name's Janet. I was curious, what if you have a medium or small size company? Is there a downside to converting? Like if you have 7,000 employee files, but only 3,500 of those are active or recently term or retired, is it a downside just to converting all of the records? Because you mentioned that you may not want to convert everyone, but if you don't have that many, is it a downside to that?
So in most cases, your Workday license will be based on the number of employees you have. That's usually what drives that decision.
Gotcha.
If you have 5,000 active employees, but you've been around for a while and you have 15,000 old terminated employees, it financially, from a monetary point of view, it may not be worth converting them. If your license isn't set up that way, if you're unlimited, there is no reason not to do it, other than it's just more data for you to have to deal with in your conversion, right? More, especially when you get into older data. Like let's say you had somebody that termed 15 years ago. Well, you might not have that job code anymore. Like as an example, that person might have been in job code ABC, but you don't have ABC anymore. And you're certainly not going to configure that job profile in your new Workday environment just to handle that person that termed 15 years ago. So while it can be done, and yeah, it is certainly something, a decision that you can make, there are some additional complications that will come with it.
Thank you. That's part of the downsides. I couldn't figure them out in my mind, so I needed to point it out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and job code is just one example, right? You have changes in taxes that happen on regular basis, right? So, how somebody had their tax withholding set up back in 2002 may be totally different than how they're set up today for current employees. So those are things to think about in that. All right.
Hey, Ryan, we have a question in the
On the-
chat
Yeah, on the
from
customization.
AJ. Yeah, so I don't know if that's something to maybe address towards the end, because I
Yeah.
thought we had something to kind of discuss, sort of. I thought there was some like gotchas that you were going to cover that might address some of those questions. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
let's-
kind of a broad-based piece, but maybe we'll address some things as we go, and maybe at the end try and have a deeper conversation there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's hang on to that till the end.
Okay.
Okay, so transforming data. We know that your data in your PeopleSoft environment is not a one-to-one match with the data as it's going to be in Workday. Employees' names are not going to change from PeopleSoft to Workday, but their job code might, or their department might, or their title might. There's a lot of different pieces that will need to be mapped to a Workday value. And so when do you transform that, right? That's always a question that you have to answer. One thing I'll mention here, Workday is big on reference IDs, right? They are the equivalent to a code in PeopleSoft. So you may have a, how can I be drawing a blank right now? You could have a locality code in PeopleSoft. In fact, I think I'll use this as an example. You may have a locality, a PeopleSoft locality, which is for local taxes. It's a code. But in Workday, there is no locality, right? There is a tax authority code, and that is not going to be a one-to-one. It's not 65,000 locality in PeopleSoft is 65,000 in Workday. So you have to take that 65,000 value for PeopleSoft locality and convert it to a Workday value. And so those the reference IDs, that's a tax authority code reference ID that you need to map to. So mappings, we have documents that we can use for mappings. They tend to have to change from client to client, but we have a general set of those that can be used as a good starting point, which I'll show you an example of here in a bit. But those mapping documents aren't going to do you any good in a SQL script, right? So you need to get the data from that mapping document into your database. And once you have that mapping in your database, then your SQL script can reference that. And while you're extracting data or going against the data you've already extracted, you can convert your PeopleSoft values to Workday values. And all that logic then is stored in your script. We've talked about validations, right? And things that you can check when you're extracting data and transforming it. You can check for people that didn't have a map, like we couldn't figure out how to map this employee's record to a Workday value. So you can do all those kinds of checks as you're extracting the data. And then ultimately, just like you do from the raw data file where you're pulling data and providing it to your functional team, you may want to provide this transform data to them as well. So I think even in this example I'll show you, we're extracting and transforming data at the same time. One thing that I will caution you on is that your functional teams usually are very good at understanding PeopleSoft data, and they're working and building their skills on understanding the Workday data. But just giving them a file of all transformed to Workday data records is going to cause them a lot more heartache when trying to figure out, are we pulling the correct data and are we mapping it correctly? So if you're going to provide your functional teams with the transform data, I always recommend that you also provide them with the PeopleSoft data pre-transformation so that they can see, okay, here's where I pulled this this state code from PeopleSoft, and that state code is this in Workday, and they can see how that was transformed. But in the end, you're going to fill out a workbook, data workbook that will ultimately be handed to your implementation team to validate and load. And think the next slide, yes, gets us into our samples there. So this, where is it? I thought I had that open. Here it is, sorry. So this is a mapping for local taxes. This is just an example. You will have many of these types of documents, but this handles all the local tax mappings. And what we see here is that I like to highlight what is PeopleSoft data, and then everything that's not highlighted is in the Workday data. And so if we're just looking through in Alabama, right, we have to know how to convert Birmingham local taxes. And so that depends on whether you're a resident or not a resident, so on and so forth. But in the end, it will give you the Workday city tax code for Birmingham. And you can see that 0107,000 is not the same as 07,000. So this is a PeopleSoft value to a Workday value mapping example. And there are a lot of them, right? In this particular case, wherever I grabbed this from, they apparently had employees in Alabama, Colorado, Delaware, so on and so forth. Your employees may all be in Chicago, or they may all be in St. Louis or wherever, and you might not need to go through all of this effort. You may just have a very short mapping document, but for whatever it is that you need, all of the mappings need to be completed. What I like to do with this is, there's, if you've got, a souped up database group or something that can take this data and import it in, that's great. But I like to just create another tab that will create insert statements in a SQL environment. And I can just, any change that I make over here, if I were to say, oh, well, I'm going to exclude this one now, then I can easily go over and refresh this. So, well, in this case here, it automatically updates, but just take this list and then go back into SQL and reload in my mappings. So that way my mapping table is always up to date with what's going on here. With all the moving parts, it's easy to get out of sync. And so cases like this where you can say, hey, we just made an update on this tab to the actual mapping, we can come over here, grab the SQL inserts and go over to the mapping table and load them in and be done with it. So just a basic example here of a mapping document, probably nothing you haven't seen before, but gives you a real world example of that. And then let's look at a script here for extracting data and transforming it at the same time. So in this case here, okay, well, we're pulling local taxes, right? So we're going to use that local tax mapping. Down here, we store that in the WD map local tax authority table. And so we join that into our extract, and we can easily then take that criteria and say, okay, match up on state, locality, resident, so on and so forth. And then when we're extracting that, we can provide the locality name and the locality. These are PeopleSoft values, and then also produce the mapped value for the Workday city tax code in this particular example. So nothing super magical here, but it does at least show you one way. There's maybe 20 different ways to do this, but this is, I've always found to be the most straightforward way to ultimately take what you're managing and mapping documents in Excel and fit them into your SQL scripts as you're pulling them. Could also be in a query or in an SQR. That this all can be done there too, but gives you an example of them. But it's the same process here. You're ultimately producing some sort of output that you can put into, at this point, now that you've transformed it, you can put that data into the workbook that will be handed to your implementation partner for validation and load against a Workday tenant. And an example of a workbook would be, we'll just stick with our local taxes here. So this is the payroll workbook for worker tax data. You can see I don't have anything in here other than these examples I've created here. But you have worker, like work county, you have residence county, work city, and residence city. There's all sorts of different taxes based on whether you're a resident or whether you're not a resident, if you work in the city or you don't work in the city. So that's all managed within these workbooks. So the workbook is essentially multiple files combined into one, and they're grouped appropriately, right? So we don't have tax data on one tab and then the next tab is benefits data, right? That would be a benefits workbook. So in the end, what you want to produce out of your script is something that you can come over here and paste right into this template. A lot of the templates that you'll get from your implementation partners will have like buttons that you can click if you were to be doing these manually. If a particular file only had 6 records that you knew you were going to have, it's probably not worth spending a week building a script and testing it and making sure it's right for 6 records. You might just come over here and hand type into a template those 6 records, and it can help you figure out like, okay, well, the PeopleSoft company is Aspire Consulting, but what does that mean for a company ID in Workday? Well, that can be behind this button to generate that field. That's really nothing that the conversion team is involved in, but your implementation partner may provide you with these types of templates as well. So this is an example of a template that in the end, this is what you would hand to your implementation partner and say, hey, let's try to load this into Workday. So that gets us to the point of where we're kind of going to talk about loading data. And holy cow, it's 2:49. Any questions on transforming data real quick? Don't see anything in the chat. Okay, let's get back to the PowerPoint here. And we talked about validation. Okay, well, what in my experiences, you have a team that is worried about pulling the data, but then you have your functional team that really are the ones that understand that data, understand how that's going to fit into a Workday environment. So I always approach it from a perspective of, we'll pull the data, but in the end, I'm going to give you the data that we've pulled and maybe transformed and have you review it. And before we give it to Workday, our implementation partner, or some other consulting firm that is Workday certified to have them load it, I want you to sign off on it, Mr. or Mrs. Functional Owner. So that way they have a little skin in the game too. They can have a chance to review the data. If we're looking at a higher file and I've pulled 100 records in a higher file, and I give that to my HCM core functional lead and say, here's the data for the higher file, and they go, wait, hang on a second. There's only 100 records here. We have 3,000 employees. Something's wrong, right? And I go, oh, yeah, I didn't notice that. So it's a second set of eyes to look at it before it goes over to Workday or to the load. And I always have a set, I want you to sign off on this file by X date. So that way, I know you are going to look at it before then. And if there are any problems, then we deal with it before they get to a sign off. So this is just kind of a case-by-case basis on whether that fits into your project team or not. But I found that it really pulls the conversion team, the technical team together with the functional team and gets everybody on the same page. So that all happens pre-load. Loading data is 99.9% of the time done by your implementation partner. Usually they're the only ones that have access to the tenant that early. They will be the ones to take the files and feed them into Workday. They usually do that in a validation mode first, which means it's not truly attempting to load the data. It's just going through and seeing if it's going to get any errors or anything that kicks out. So validation mode produces error reports. Those usually go back and forth from the implementation team to the client. So the functional team and the technical team can review those errors and say, oh, we need to make a quick tweak to this script. You can do that, get them a new file if you need, or you can always wait until the next build. But that initial validation mode gives you a basic, here's what kind of issues you're going to run into if you don't do anything. After the validation mode cycle happens, then your implementation partner will load the data. They will still get an error report. So if anything fails, there will be an error report with that load. And they should also be producing a validation report for you. So there's two outputs to a loaded file. The validation report tells you here's who was successful, and the error report tells you who erred out. And ultimately, we're going to try and compare that back to our extracted data, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. One thing I will call out, because you'll inevitably, if you go to Workday, you'll find out that, yeah, there are cases where the implementation partner does not load data. Usually this is custom objects and things that, if you track, I don't know, how long somebody's been at a certain location and you want that data in Workday, that would be a custom object that you would load in. And the functional teams are usually the ones to load that data. So that does happen, but for the standard hire files and compensation files and tax files and all that, your implementation partner will handle the load of those files. So when we get that as a conversion team, when we get those validation and error reports back from a file being loaded, I like to be able to tell the functional team, okay, here was what was on your initial file. You had 10,000 records and 200 of them aired out. Okay, and we should be able to tell them exactly what 200 aired out and why they aired out. And then we need to tell them the other 9,800 loaded successfully, but when we look at the data that we provided versus what's coming back out of Workday, we see some differences, and we really shouldn't be seeing differences. So what's going on? We need to investigate this. We have some scripts that we've built that will take those error and validation reports and bring those back into the database, where we can then merge them together with the initially extracted file, so that we can say, here's what was successful and here's what has a problem, and ultimately give that to the functional team. So an example of that would be, this would be a post-load validation result, that report that I could give to a functional team. It would tell us, here's how many records were on the actual data file. We know that 5 of them aired out because our error report has 5 errors in it. And the validation report, in this case, has 619. Well, when you add those two together, you don't get to 625, right? So somebody's missing. What's going on there? And I think this is actually a real world example. So out of this, we can then say, okay, well, here's the breakdown, right? 591 of the 625 match 100%. They loaded and they match our data 100%. 5 of them we know from this error report. We have 5 of them that aired out and didn't load. And we know that there's this one person missing. So we're going to figure out who that is. And then we're also finding that there are 28 records that show that they loaded, but we have a different value when it comes back out of Workday than what we provided. And what's going on there. So I like to provide this kind of a summary view, and then also talk about, and then look at details. So I've gone and changed a bunch of this stuff so that it's not anybody's actual data, but this is the beginning of what was a real validation report. And so we can see that, okay, for employee 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they matched 100%, right? Their company ID, their tax state, the effective date, and the tax code, and their additional amount all matched 100%. That's what I'm saying. Our comparison has found that it's matched 100%. If we filter on this, we can see some of these other differences, like mismatched data, right? We can look at that. So here are 3 cases where the data didn't match. What I like to be able to provide to the functional team is, here's what was in the data file on one line, and then say, here's what was in the post-load validation report on the next line, so that they can go through and say, oh, it's the state. Why do we have DC as the state in Workday, but we provided Maryland? You know, that's something that we need to look into. So I find that this is very helpful to the functional teams to digest. Okay, how did that load just go? Was it really successful? What kind of errors do I need to deal with? And these are things that you're trying to clean up in those early builds, CNP, end to end, and probably still even a little bit in parallel, so that when you get to your go live, your hope is that you're not having mismatched data or things airing out or people missing, right? That just didn't load at all and they're not in an error report. So what happened to them? So it's all iterative and trying to, from each build, improve on your previous one. So I'm going to quickly go. Any questions real quick on post load? I just have a couple more slides.
Nothing
See anything in the chat?
Right?
Okay. All right. So there's a couple things I just wanted to kind of throw out there, just some food for thought items for you. I don't know where you all stand in the process of potentially going to Workday, but and some of these are, it doesn't even really matter if it's Workday or if it's Oracle or wherever you're going next. I find it very helpful to have a file tracker, and that can just be a simple spreadsheet that these are all the files that we need to create for each build. In that tracker, you should track the status of it, like not started, or it's in functional validation, or we are complete with it, right? We've done our post-load validation and everything looks good. So you need a status. You need to know dates, like when should I be pulling this file, and when should I have to get it to the work, the implementation partner. Well, when do I need to get the post-load validation to my functional team? So we get this all done in a timely manner. In there, you can track high-level topics on the file, like, hey, we ran into a problem with tax codes, or we need to deal with job profiles or whatever. You can keep some basic notes in there. Real issues that you uncover, whether they be from your error reports or your post-load validation comparisons, you should track in an issue log. That way you can say, hey, we've closed this issue, or this issue is still open. It's very important not to lose track and have things fall off of your radar. So an issue log is critical. I would highly recommend that you have change control for your extract scripts and your post-load validation scripts. So that way, if somebody makes a change and the next time you get to a build, it goes haywire, you know what was changed, so you can undo that, so you can get your file extracted. So change control on any kind of programmatical work that you do when it comes to conversion. We talked earlier about versioning the data files, so I'm not going to reiterate there, but having an end-to-end version, having a parallel version, so that you can look back from time to time. When it comes to the actual data, one thing I'll point out real quick is that when you're taking Joe from PeopleSoft and putting him into Workday, you are hiring him in Workday. It is not, generally speaking, in fact, all the cases that I've been in, it's not you're pulling in Joe's history. You are starting him brand new in Workday. So dates are usually a battle. Does your hire date line up with your position start date? Does it line up with your original hire date? Does it line up with the compensation date? All those dates can be out of sync from in Workday's eyes in your PeopleSoft environment. And so, be prepared for working through, especially if you're an older organization where you might have gone to PeopleSoft from the mainframe environment, right? And you're trying to make sense of all this really old data for people that magically are still working, 40 years later. So dates can be a challenge. The concept of primary and secondary is kind of lost in Workday. You do have a primary job, but then you have additional jobs. And the movement of them is slightly different than how it works in PeopleSoft. So You don't have employee record number anymore. It is all position based. So just some things to keep in mind there. Also encourage you not to mix your data cleanup. Conversion is not an attempt to clean up data. So if you know you have data issues, deal with those separate. Do not build them into your scripts. Don't be changing people's compensation in your script so that you can get it to load into Workday. You quickly lose track of what happened to that data in between PeopleSoft and Workday, and connecting the dots will forever be a nightmare. So just something to keep in mind there. Overrides, you can create date overrides. You can create overrides for anything, but if you manage and store those in a table in your environment that you're extracting data, you'll always have record of, yeah, I know PeopleSoft says Ryan's hire date is January 1st, but we changed it to January 10th in our override because of some other data that we know about, and therefore now it's going to be January 10th in Workday. So keep that in mind. I've seen cases where we've said, oh, we're not going to need overrides. Our data's good. It's all good. And towards the last minute, you're going, we need to create an override here because there's just no way to do this from a conversion perspective. So overrides are okay, but they need to be documented and stored somewhere. You might want to get into some pre-extract validations to check for bad data. If you know you have cases where data is bad, you might want to write some scripts that you can pull and identify those scenarios prior to getting into a build and giving your functional teams time to work with your business to get that stuff cleaned up. And then the last thing is, inevitably there will always be manual work that has to happen post go live. You always hope for it to be minimal, and it usually is, but there's always work that needs to be done manually, and keeping track of who's going to do it and what needs to be done is going to be super critical when you get to go live. That you don't lose track of, oh, that's right, we forgot about, this group of people that are going to have to be manually hired in Workday. So, you might not think that you're going to have that manual work because you got all these scripts and things that are pulling the data, but it happens, and finding a way to keep track of that is critical. So. Went longer than I had hoped. I know we're even past the 3 o'clock time. I can stick around and answer any kind of questions that anybody has. I apologize if I've kept anybody late, but we could talk about this for 3 days straight and still have more to discuss. So I'm going to stop talking. If anybody has questions, we can either do this through the chat or come off mute and ask your question.
Well, we still have AJ's question out there, Ryan.
Oh, yes, we do.
Maybe touched on some of it in terms of essentially data integrity, right? Things syncing up. So I think that's one way to prepare, is kind of going through your data to know, do we have any gaps or things that don't make sense? So like an original hire date is after a hire date or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Where maybe an update happened behind the scenes where it just hasn't been caught. Not knowing where those customizations are, what they're on, it's kind of hard to address other things. I think one of the most important things you can look at is those customizations is what are they based around, and whatever next gen system, if you will, you're looking at is, making sure you're asking those questions of that next generation of, well, how can it address what we're doing here today? And if it can't, then it's finding a solution maybe outside the system that then allows you to push that in, or however you're going to track or do what you're doing. Or really ask the other question from a business process perspective of, can we change our business process to meet what the system delivers as is, to simplify our life in the future state? Like,
right.
Why do we have this customization?
Yeah. I do see a lot of customizations kind of going bye-bye in a PeopleSoft to Workday conversion, just because you have something, a custom bolt-on in PeopleSoft, that doesn't mean it's going to be in Workday, right? So that the functional teams have to work with the implementation partner to identify those customizations and really work through what are the solutions for that in Workday. And if they don't exist, can it be managed through a custom object? And if it can't, then then your organization has to find some sort of a third party application or homegrown deal to deal with that. But
And when we're saying custom object, we're talking about a custom object within the Workday
within Workday.
walls.
Yeah. So basically,
and that's what you were alluding to with those EIBs, right? Where
correct.
Because it's not a quote unquote delivered, as it were, out of the box, like the higher portion, they support loading the data, but usually you're going to have to create your own EIB push to get it to where it needs to go.
Right. Yeah. So let me think of I had a client where they were tracking who got publications from their company, right? Their company would send out like newsletters and people could opt out of that. Well, that functionality, opting out of the company newsletter is not a Workday functionality, right? So that data was converted as a custom object. And quite honestly, the concept of custom object is irrelevant to a conversion team, but it's very important to the functional team because they're the ones that have to figure all that. But when we talk about, there are all flavors of customizations in a PeopleSoft environment, right? Pages that get new fields added to them and new buttons and text and whatever. But I've really found that no matter how customized you are, it really, in the end, it still, for the most part, fits into a Workday field some way, somehow, right? And so I pulled back up this sample DGW. In the end, your technical and functional teams have to know about the customization to know that in this made up example that, our business title is in the PS ABC company job table, right? That's their own custom table.
It's not, yeah.
So that's where you manage all that.
So I think, AJ, to answer kind of your other question about business process mapping prior to conversion, that is certainly a great place to start to really understand what the actual business process flow is. Because if you're just looking at even going through the software selection process, knowing exactly what you do and why you do it will help you choose the best software. So if it's Workday you're targeting, or Oracle Cloud, or again, some other solution, knowing what your business is doing, why it's doing it, and how PeopleSoft is currently serving that need will help you make sure that when you're making that selection for the next piece of your next software, that it can handle it, or there will be a solution for it, or hey, this is a really critical thing that we do, and it is a customization. We need to make sure the next gen can handle it in some shape or form or another, or what the solution would be. So yeah, business process map, if you don't have that stuff today, it would be really critical for you to have, because it'll also serve you well during the conversion process. Identifying test scenarios you need, identifying configuration you may need, all those things would kind of build out of that.
Yeah, I'll second that. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm not sure it's possible to talk about data conversion. There'll only be 2 questions, but maybe if we got a really good grip here.
I just want to follow up on that discussion. That's really exciting, the comments that you guys made, and it's really fascinating. I do want to understand a little bit more that what is the role that the organization as us, since we don't have expertise on Workday or Oracle Cloud. We do understand PeopleSoft. We have been working with PeopleSoft for a long number of years. So how do we really, partner with the vendor or system integrator in the most effective way, right? So what information should we provide to accelerate this conversion process, or what are the if we have a timeline, right? How do we really work together effectively so that we stick to the project plan and the timeline?
So yeah, I mean, I think you'll need to seek out somebody that can help you identify, those options of where you're going to go next. Do you need to have demos done by Workday and Oracle in work with their teams. I mean, there's a lot of work that happens before you ever even consider converting data, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, yeah, and then once, you know, if you go the Workday route, you're the partner consulting firms that you have as options are going to be different than if you go the Oracle route, right? So that's something that you'll identify after you pick your next solution. And then from there, then that's when you do these deep dives into your business processes so that they understand, because they're going to be the experts on the Workday side to help you figure out, okay, this fits into the mold of Workday or it doesn't. So you do all your fit gap analysis and all of that, you know, and then obviously that would be done even ahead of picking a solution. But
I think
Charlie,
the other thing you really, I would say, I think the other thing you really need from an organizational perspective is that top-down support from the highest all the way down. So if you hit bottlenecks where you've got an area of the business that's not being as engaged they need to, there's that top-level support to make it successful. In all the projects we've been involved with, when you have that top-down support, those are the most successful projects, right? Because then you can move roadblocks, you can get things pushed forward, you can get those decisions made that need to be made about, are we keeping a customization, trying to work it, are we going to drop this, are we going to change a business process? And those things can be worked overall instead of just sitting. Because the worst thing you're going to have with the reason you're not going to hit your timelines is because you don't have full buy-in somewhere in the organization, right? Or you come across something and you don't have that all hand. That's really your biggest push with deadlines, but also being prepared. So again, the business process mapping that you brought up, that is a great way to be ready to address a lot of facets of what the conversion process is going to do and be. And right, your implementation partner, be it us or someone else or whomever, right, would work alongside you to help develop those plans and timelines as more information comes out, right? Like, well, if we're doing an HR conversion, how many people are we converting? Do we need to do W-2s, or are we going to outsource payroll? Is payroll already outsourced? If payroll's already outsourced, then that just becomes an integration point. We don't have to worry about the W-2s. There's a lot of different facets. It just depends on what you're doing. And then also the scope, right? Are we doing HR and financials and supply chain all at once? Are we going to do HR first and then roll the other ones if we're trying to do it all? There's a lot of different facets that impact those other components.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's very helpful. Thank you. I think I just want to add that, which route we're gonna go. That's gonna, we don't really know. It's gonna be which,
Oh, sure.
rhetorical,
Yeah, no,
that's. But I guess, are there any common, regardless of which route we go, are there any, preparations that we can do today to plan for the transition? Business process mapping. I mean, you guys explained it. I think it makes sense why we should do it. But are there any other recommendations that you guys have for customers?
I would look at your customizations and figure out which ones can actually go away or be replaced with other functionality, so it's not even a customization. Now, if the customization is a full bolt-on where you're storing additional data and kind of other processing, those are harder to do. But if you've got customizations around, any sort of automation or a process that, like, hey, maybe can this process be moved out of PeopleSoft? Do you have a data warehouse or databases outside of PeopleSoft that could kind of achieve the same thing? And then it becomes agnostic, right? Whether or not you choose to stay on PeopleSoft for 5 more years, or you move to a Workday or an Oracle Cloud or Lawson or pick whatever your software is, right? It becomes somewhat agnostic, and it's more of, well, we just need to connect this into whatever that's going to be. It becomes an integration point, but the process and the data is all maintained here outside the application. We have a way to support it internally, and we're just, it's a matter of, maybe it's something that feeds into payroll, right? And right now you have it in PeopleSoft to capture the data. Can you take that out and have it live outside the system and still be effective? And then as you plug and play whatever your payroll system is going to be, doesn't matter, right? You just have to plug into it and have it feed, and what are the tweaks we have to make in order to feed it. So it's looking at anything like that as well. Like, can you take it out of PeopleSoft if it's a full blown customization, which is kind of hard to look at when you might look at PeopleSoft and be like, well, the benefit of PeopleSoft at the time was we can put what we need to into one application, so to speak, and it's done by one support staff, right? Like it's our PeopleSoft team, right? So you kind of have to look and gauge that. You might also have to consider, well, how far out are we? You know, is this worth maintaining separately outside the system for a year, 2 years? That also, you know, a fair question to ask potential implementation partner is, you know, as part of the RFP process, you know, we would like a sketched out, it doesn't have to be super detailed, but, you know, timeline plan, right? And also ask questions like, well, what's the commitment from our individuals? Do we need to commit 50% of our subject matter experts' time? Do we need to commit 100% of a developer's time to support conversion? That'll also help you know what you need to support the project in addition to just having a partner.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense too. So that you have resources and, you know, time allocated upfront, or maybe have this information upfront with the partner so that you guys can help and determine the resources and the tasks
100%.
that will be needed, and then prepare a more realistic
Because
timeline.
right. It may be that, okay, well, we're either going to outsource the backfill of PeopleSoft and get our people on, meaning like you guys yourselves would be like, you're going to backfill PeopleSoft, right? And you're going to move your PeopleSoft team to new software, right, to support the conversion and learn and do whatever, right? Or you say, nope, we need to leave one person on, but so that also helps figure out how much support do we need from our partner, right? Is it we need, you know, oh, we don't have enough subject matter experts to go around because it's year end when we're going to be doing this, that, or the other. So, all right, well, that's fine. We can help support that. We can just throw another FTE in there to do that support. So yeah, you can work with your partner to figure out the best balance of resources so you guys can still own it at the end and you're not just solely reliant when the partner's done loading the data, right? And you're ready to flip the switch. But again, that's a balance with deeper internal conversations around that process.
Absolutely. I do have one other question, but you know, unless you want to cover somebody else's question, because I don't want to take all the time.
I do not see any other questions in chat. So AJ, you've got the floor.
All right. So, you know, for customers that have historically had PeopleSoft, but over time, you know, have off-the-shelf software that integrate with PeopleSoft, you know, it could be, you know, timekeeping system or learning management
whatever,
system.
right? Yep.
You know, yeah. So, you know, back when they started with, you know, smart new hires templates and smart hire templates, but, you know, over time they acquired off-the-shelf solutions. So, how does that really, you know, complicate the conversion process and, you know, some of the sequels and the templates that you guys showed in this presentation? What are some of the, you know, additional tasks or some of the considerations that you guys have seen before, or you have different templates to accommodate such situations? Or what do you really offer to customers that have, you know,
that's going to
multiple
depend
off-the-shelf
on what you're doing, right? So let's say you've got a separate recruiting software, right, outside of TAM. So you decide, hey, we're using whatever software. That's a discussion point to say, are we going to continue to use that software, or are we going to switch over to using Oracle Cloud, Workday, whatever software for recruiting? And so if that's the case, then you're going to have to work, you know, the idea there is, okay, well, do we have access to that data to extract it? Or do we need to work with the third party to say, this is what we need, and, you know, new contract with that third party software provider to say, listen, we're going to end our contract on this date, but we need help converting data out. It's probably a new contract, new terms or whatever for service level agreements to make sure that things are lived up to support that. Or are you going to keep on with software? If you keep on with the software, the impact to your conversion then is it's an integration point, right? So then it becomes, all right, what do we need to do from an integration perspective to make that happen? Can our third-party software support a non-production test, or how can they handle testing? I mean, most software providers have the ability to do testing outside of production, but depending on who you're running with, they may not. So the initial decision point there is, are we going to continue on with this third party, or are we going to switch to using the features of the new software we're going to, because it provides the same thing? And then once you make that decision point, then it becomes a decision really of, is it conversion or is it integration?
Gotcha. I think more than likely, with this, the advancements that cloud technology has seen, be it Workday, Oracle Cloud, or any other, it does make sense to kind of, roll up different functionalities into one. But, from the timeline perspective, it sounds like it's gonna add to the timeline, because now there are this new task where you have to either consume the feed from the vendor or do certain different kind of mapping.
But realize, if
So
you're consuming the feed from the vendor too, some of these softwares have, I'm going to say, integration partners, in the sense that they have pre-built integrations, right? So that can help streamline that effort.
Okay.
Again, it just all depends on what you have and who you're going to. But a lot of Oracle Cloud and Workday both have made strides with different vendors for different areas to have those pre-built integrations, because they realize certain levels of software are standard third-party softwares for different things, and so they're going to have those built in. Perhaps it's on the benefit side with somebody like a Fidelity, or
yes,
with a Blue Cross Blue Shield or something like that for integration feeds back and forth. Those aren't specific to the question you would ask, but just the idea of their pre-built feeds. Can it impact the timeline? Absolutely, but you build that then into the project, right? Are
Yes.
we turning new functionality on? So we have to not only get the data across from a conversion perspective, depending on what it is, but then we're standing up a new piece of the tower within our own application. But if you're standing up the whole thing, it may not add that much time. It would impact testing, right? You're going to test an integration feed versus functionality. There may be more configuration involved in, which could, be a longer lead on your project than just doing an integration point, because all the configs already exist in the third-party system.
Right. And that's very thoughtful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
I don't have any other questions. So again, thank you, Ryan. This presentation was really helpful.
Great. Glad to hear that. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? I would say the overall thing here is, while this was specific of a PeopleSoft to Workday conversion, a lot of the ideas that I think Ryan covered, which he talked to as well, is they're somewhat, agnostic to wherever you might be going, right? These are just things to consider, approaches to consider, the pre and post validation, perhaps coming up with a methodology for, repeatable file creation process for those data extracts, right? Something that can be done, run over and over again with consistency. And then even considering like, oh yeah, well, we're only going to convert 6 rows of this historical data that we have, but it's needed for these 6 people. Maybe it's a union-based shop and we've got these 6 special people that we have to track for whatever reason, right? That might make more sense just to put them into the initial file and populate than having to build a whole process around that. It just depends on what you're doing. But while some of the things we showed were specific to Workday, that load file, for sure, Oracle Cloud and Workday have similar setups in that, where there's a sort of predefined template that you're going to push your data through back into the application for loading purposes. Okay. All right, well, if there's nothing else, we did record the session. It will be available. If anyone's interested in getting a recording of the session, you can just respond back either in the chat here before you jump off, or I think you guys all received the invite. So if you just respond back to that as well through, I think, just a reply, we should get it, and we can make sure you get a copy of the presentation.
Yep. And I also put our contact information on here as well. Realize I didn't have that up earlier. So if anybody needs that, don't hesitate to reach out with any kind of questions.
Thank you. It was very informative.
Thank you.
Bye.